Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today begins a series of episodes about what to do with your sorrow and grief. And let me just say at the outset that I believe sorrow and grief are vital. Vital means pertaining to life. Think of the medical term vital signs, signs of life. If you have sorrow and grief, it does not mean there is something wrong with you. It means that your vital signs are working properly. In other words, you are alive. One premise of today's episode is that sorrow and grief are vital. That is, if you want to be fully alive, you need to befriend your sadnesses, your sorrows, your griefs. Much of what I'm going to engage today comes from Francis Weller's excellent book titled The Wild Edge of Sorrow. I will quote Francis Weller multiple times in this series of episodes. And the book that has helped me so much of his is The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Let's begin by talking about the place we find ourselves with regard to sorrow and grief. For most modern people, the place we find ourselves is in a land where grief and sorrow are unwelcome. Unwelcome. In other words, most of us do not feel like the people around us can bear the depth of our sorrow and grief. As a result, we take our sorrows and griefs and we push them out of our awareness. And in this way, we declare to our sorrow, "You are not welcome in my life." It's as if we believe that the sorrow we carry will not be welcomed by others. And since belonging is so very important to all of us human beings, we banish our sadness from our awareness because we don't want to risk our belonging. Now, here's how Francis Weller gets at this idea in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Weller says, "We become convinced that our sadness is the cause of our unacceptability, and we are more than willing to cleave off portions of our life for the sake of inclusion." Weller's point is that we keep our sadness hidden so that we will continue to be accepted and welcomed by those in our community. We keep our sadness hidden so that we will continue to be accepted by those people who are important to us. Now, boy, can I relate to this. I don't know how true this is for you, but it is spot on for me. I have a truckload of sorrow inside my heart, and I am deeply reluctant to let others see that sorrow. Why? Because I'm afraid that if they saw my sorrow, they wouldn't want to be friends with me anymore. They wouldn't want to be in my life anymore. They couldn't bear it. But let's just hold on. Let's just take a look at sorrow and grief for a minute, shall we? Let's just take a look at these deeply human and godly emotions. To begin, let me define our terms. For our purposes today, I'm not making a distinction between sorrow and grief. I'm using both terms interchangeably to refer to a feeling of distress caused by loss or disappointment. My working definition of sorrow or grief is a feeling of distress caused by loss or disappointment. Now, let's just take a closer look at this definition. First, sorrow is a feeling of distress. In other words, it hurts. It's a painful feeling. If you allow yourself to actually feel your sorrow, it will hurt. You will feel pain inside. Second, sorrow is a feeling of distress caused by loss. When you lose someone or something important to you, you will feel sorrow. If you lose a spouse, you will feel sorrow. If you lose your job, you will feel sorrow. If you lose the ability to do an activity that you love, you will feel sorrow. But third, sorrow is a feeling of distress caused by loss or disappointment. Now, this word disappointment is a very, very important part of the definition of sorrow and grief. You will feel the painful, distressing feeling of sorrow when you are disappointed. You don't only feel sorrow when you lose something. You also feel it when you are disappointed about something. Now, please hear the next sentence. Disappointment is a very hard feeling for people with a history of trauma. In fact, for people who have experienced trauma, disappointment is one of the most painful feelings that your body feels. So, you will feel sorrow if you wanted to be chosen or included in something and you were left out. That's a disappointment. And disappointment causes us to feel the painful ache of sorrow. You will feel sorrow if you wanted to go on a trip and you got sick and you were not able to go. That's a disappointment. You will feel sorrow if you wanted to have sex with your spouse last night and you didn't get to. That's a disappointment. Let me ask a simple question. Do you let yourself feel sorrow about your disappointments? Take the sex example. If you want to have sex, you don't get to. Do you let yourself feel sorrow about your disappointment? Most people don't. Most people either feel anger at their partner or anger at themselves, but they don't feel sorrow. The anger allows you to escape the feeling of sorrow. Now, when you experience loss or disappointment, your body's natural response to that loss or disappointment is to hurt, to ache, to feel sorrow and grief. You cannot be an alive human being without experiencing loss and disappointment frequently. Let me say that again. You cannot be a fully alive human being without experiencing loss and disappointment on a regular basis. If you let yourself want, then you are going to experience disappointment often. If your wanter is fully operational, you are going to experience disappointment often, which means that if you are an alive human being, you are often going to feel sorrow and grief. Now, in that book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller identifies different kinds, different types of sorrow and grief. And I just want to go through a couple of them. The first type is the sorrow we experience with the loss of someone or something we love. So, when someone you love dies, you feel sorrow and grief. You ache, you hurt. This is the type of sorrow and grief that most people are familiar with. And it is the only type of sorrow that most of us are allowed to feel in our modern world. But please hear the next point. There are many other kinds of sorrow besides losing someone or something you love. Absolutely. For example, Weller points out that each of us have had experiences in life in which we needed to be loved in a particular moment and we were not. This is a type of grief. Yes, we carry grief in our bodies about the moments in which we needed to be loved and we were not well loved. There have been moments in your life in which you needed to be seen, you needed to be soothed, understood, validated, cared for, comforted, and you were not. That is a loss. That needs to be grieved. You carry sorrow in your nervous system about those experiences. The death of a loved one is not the only sorrow you hold in your body. It's not. It's simply the only sorrow that modern American culture says it's okay to have. But your body also holds sorrow and grief about those experiences in which you needed care, comfort, the kindness of another person engaging with you. You needed those things and you didn't receive them. When you have repeated experiences of not being seen well, not being soothed, not being understood or taken seriously, those are losses. When you need to be loved and you are not, that is deeply disappointing. It is deeply disappointing when you are a child, and it is deeply disappointing when you are an adult. Yes, when you are an adult as well. In fact, the etymology of the word disappointment can be traced back to the idea of missing an appointment with someone. A disappointment is a broken appointment. What's that mean? It means someone was supposed to be there for you and they didn't show up. That's where the word disappointment comes from. Now, another type of sorrow that Weller identifies is the sorrow of not being welcomed. The sorrow of not belonging anywhere. Not having a community that welcomes you and comes around you and says, you belong here. Yes, you have grief inside your body about losing things that you don't even realize are losses. This is the plight of living in many modern cultures today. Here's how Weller puts it. He says, when we are born, we are designed to anticipate a certain quality of welcome and engagement. In short, we expect what our ancestors experienced as their birthright, namely the container of the village. Boy, do I love that. The container of the village. Okay, I am going to talk a lot about this notion of the container of the village. What is Francis Weller talking about when he says that we were designed to anticipate the container of the village? I'll tell you what he's talking about. You were created in the image of a triune God, a we, not an I. Your brain and body have been designed for community. God made you to be welcomed into a village, a community of others who enjoy you and who speak over your head, you belong with us. To say it differently, you were not designed for the individualism that plagues modern American culture. You were designed to need the container of the village. What do I mean by the village? Okay, look, the village refers to other people who are wiser than you, stronger than you, and deeply committed to your freedom and flourishing. This is what the elders of the village are supposed to be. Most modern American cultures, not all, but most, are deeply lacking in elders. And as a result, we are lacking the container of the village. And what Francis Weller points out is that the lack of the village, in other words, the lack of older, wiser, stronger people, is one of the deepest sources of our sorrow. Here's how he puts it. He says, on some level, we are waiting for the village to appear so we can fully acknowledge our sorrows. At the core of this grief is our longing to belong. That's Francis Weller. Now, those are very true words. Let me say them again. On some level, we are waiting, each of us, we are waiting for the village to appear so we can fully acknowledge our sorrows. At the core of this grief is our longing to belong. Many of us are reluctant to fully acknowledge our sorrows. We're reluctant to feel our grief because we know that we are not surrounded by people who are more mature than us and can therefore hold our sorrow. We know that we are not surrounded by elders, by people who are wiser than us and stronger than us and more mature than us. And therefore, we are not sure how we will be received if we fully acknowledge and feel our sorrows in public. Francis Weller points out that many people have this vague sense that something is missing in their lives, this sense that we're lacking something. And here's how Weller puts it. He says, our profound feelings of lacking something are not a reflection of a personal failure, but the reflection of a society that has failed to offer us what we were designed to expect. That is so spot on. Do you have a vague sense inside yourself? Do you have a vague sense that something's lacking, that something is missing? If you do, perhaps that feeling is not indicative of a personal failure. Perhaps you feel that way because deep down, you know that something actually is missing, namely, a village of elders who can surround you and welcome you and provide a container for your sorrows. What if you and I were designed by God to need the container of the village? What if God made human beings to need the container of the village? Okay, that was a couple of kinds of sorrow and grief. And at this point, what I want to do is I want to transition to talking about, okay, what are we supposed to do with our sorrow, with our grief? What are we supposed to do with it? And let's begin with an excellent sentence by Francis Weller. He says it so well. Here's how he puts it. He says, look, grief is not a problem to be solved, not a condition to be medicated, but a deep encounter with an essential experience of being human. Sorrow and grief are not problems to be solved. Your sadness is not something that needs to be fixed. If you have lots of sorrow, it does not mean that there is something wrong with you. It means that you are paying attention. Because the world is filled with injustices, heartbreaks, betrayals, and losses. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a deep encounter with an essential experience of being human. In other words, our task is to welcome our sorrow and grief so that we can see what it has to teach us about ourselves and about the world around us. Here's another great sentence from Weller. He says, by welcoming grief, we are freed from our obsession with emotional progress. Oh, that is so good. That is so good. By welcoming grief, we are freed from our obsession with emotional progress. Most modern American people are obsessed with emotional progress. As a result, we feel like we're doing something wrong if we aren't constantly improving and rising above our pain and problems. It is very important to understand that modern American culture is committed primarily to two things: denial and numbness. Denial of reality is our ethos. And when we can't deny reality, we usually opt for some form of numbness. To say this slightly differently, we are supremely committed to the ascent. The ascent. We are focused on going up. We want the stock market to rise. We want to move up in our careers. We want to get ahead of the Joneses. You hear the language. It's all language of the ascent. The ascent is so unabashedly American that we don't even question if it's how we should be living our lives. When you are so focused on the ascent, you can't look at and engage emotions that invite you to descend, which is what sorrow and grief do. Sorrow and grief will take you down to the floor sometimes. And since we are so focused on ascending, we deny our sorrow and grief. And when that doesn't work, we numb as best we can our sorrow and grief. However, please understand there is an immense cost to our denial and our numbing. There is an immense cost to our obsession with the assent. And what is the cost? The cost is our aloneness. The cost is our deep isolation from one another. When everyone is ascending, it is very difficult to connect with one another. Because why? Why? Because connection only occurs when someone is vulnerable. Connection, in other words, happens when we let people into our descent. Connection happens when we let people into the things in our hearts, minds, and bodies that are unwell, that are not shiny, that are not evidence of our successes and growth. Let me give you an example. Look, put me in a room with 3 other successful podcasters. If the 4 of us only talk about our download numbers and our podcast successes, there will be precious little emotional connection between us. If all we do is compare how each of us is ascending, there will be no connection among us. And all 4 of us will feel isolated and alone. This is America. There is no village. There will be no emotional connection among us until one of us takes the risk of talking about where we are hurting, where we have unmet longing, where we have disappointment, where we feel shame, where we have sorrow. There will be no connection between us 4 podcasters until one of us takes the risk of sharing about our descent. The possibility for emotional connection will not be present until one of us repents of our mutual commitment to the ascent. In other words, repents of our denial and numbness and risks sharing about his or her heartache. This is what creates the possibility for genuine community. Openness about our sorrow and grief and disappointments is what invites the village to appear and to surround us. So, summary of this point. Our modern obsession with the ascent forces us to deny our sorrow, our pain, our fears, our disappointments. We don't share these things with one another. But it's not like your sorrows, disappointments, and griefs just go away just because you deny them. Oh no, they are there right now, resting in the basement of your belly, waiting to be taken seriously, waiting for care, waiting for honest, gentle engagement. Francis Weller points out that when sorrow and grief are forced into the basement, they become coated in a mantle of shame. Boy, this is really important. It's not merely that you have lots of sorrow and grief inside. It's also that you are ashamed of how much sorrow and grief is there, which is to say, you do not welcome your sorrow and grief. Since you fear that others will not welcome, that others will not make a place for your sorrow and grief, you push those feelings down and you declare them unwelcome as well. You hide your sorrow and grief. You hide it from others and you hide it from yourself. And as a result, there is no place for your sorrow and grief to go. And when sorrow and grief cannot be brought out into the light, very bad things happen in the human heart and body. Here's how Weller puts it. He says, grief becomes problematic when the conditions needed to help us work with grief are absent. Grief becomes problematic. It's not inherently problematic. It becomes problematic when the conditions needed to help us work with grief are absent. So the reality is that sorrow and grief are indeed deeply problematic for most of us. Why? Not because there's nothing inherent to sorrow and grief that makes them problematic. The reason they are problematic for most of us is because the conditions needed to help us work with grief are absent. Which brings us to a very important question. What are the conditions needed to allow us to work with grief? What are the conditions needed to allow our sorrow and grief to pass through our bodies and to heal? Alas, we will need to wait until the next episode for an answer to that question. This is where we will pick up in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for listening to this first episode in a series on how we are to engage our sorrows and our griefs. In the next episode, I will get very specific about what conditions we need to allow us to work profitably with our sorrow and our grief.